All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You've sent in some really thought-provoking stuff on how we can better support students who are dealing with both reading and behavior challenges.
Yeah,
And we've zeroed in on, a pretty major piece of research here, a meta-analysis that really digs deep into reading interventions for this very specific group of students. And I think, when we think about what sets students up for success, like across the board in school, strong reading skills are just like, it's the gateway.
absolutely. It really is. And I think a key piece here too is, thinking about who we're talking about when we talk about this specific population, students identified with emotional and behavioral disorders,
Right.
or EBD is how we see it a lot of times, and then also those with ADHD.
Yeah.
And what we know consistently in the research is that those students tend to struggle more with reading than their typically developing peers.
Exactly. And this is where, one of the things that came up in the sources that you shared that I think is particularly concerning is that, these students are actually less likely to respond to typical reading interventions.
Hmm.
Like the things that we know work for other kids who are struggling with reading don't always work for this group. And we know if we don't address these challenges, I mean, they're intertwined, right?
Absolutely.
Reading and behavior, we're looking at long-term stuff, right?
Mhm.
Higher rates of absenteeism, more suspensions, and, down the road, potentially higher likelihood of being underemployed.
Mhm.
So, the big question here is really, what does the research tell us about effective reading interventions specifically for this group of students? That's kind of the mission of this deep dive, is
Yeah.
to go through this meta-analysis, this collection of studies that you shared, and see what we can take away from it. So, let's jump right in.
Mm.
First off, this meta-analysis looked at a bunch of different studies,
Yeah.
and the big picture finding was actually pretty encouraging, which is that reading interventions, on the whole, did have a statistically significant positive impact on reading outcomes. The researchers calculated an effect size of G equals 0.86, which is considered a pretty large effect.
That's great. Yeah.
So that's a good starting point, I guess.
Right.
Now, one of the things that they looked at was, this idea of reading and behavior difficulties. Like, why do they often go together?
Yeah.
So they explored a couple of different theories, and they focused on three in particular. First, that difficulties with reading can lead to those behavioral issues.
Mhm.
The second is kind of the reverse, that the behavior problems are actually what's getting in the way of reading progress.
Right.
And then the third is the possibility that there's this kind of bidirectional relationship where, the two just kind of feed off each other negatively. So let's start with that first idea, the possibility that reading struggles actually contribute to behavior problems. So in the studies that were included, researchers, they looked at students who got reading interventions, and they wanted to see, well, did those improvements in reading also lead to improvements in behavior?
Right. And this is where, kind of connecting back to what you were just talking about with those larger findings, what we saw was that the reading interventions did a good job at improving reading skills,
Mhm.
but they didn't necessarily lead to huge improvements in behavior.
Hmm.
So they compared a few different things. They looked at studies that provided reading intervention on its own and compared it to a control group that didn't receive any academic or behavioral support. They also compared interventions that combined reading and behavior support to interventions that just had the behavior support alone. And what they found across the board, the 9 studies that looked at just reading intervention in isolation, and the 5 that actually reported behavior outcomes, there wasn't a strong connection between improved reading and then automatic improvement in behavior.
That is really interesting. So what about the flip side? What if the behavior's really the main issue and
Right.
it's what's kind of holding kids back from making progress with their reading? What did they find when they looked at that possibility?
Yeah, so this is where they were really questioning, can we improve reading skills by just addressing the behavior problems directly?
Yeah.
And they looked at studies that focused mainly on behavior interventions, either on their own or sometimes paired with reading support, and then compared them to, no intervention or just reading support only. And the main takeaway here was that behavioral interventions, even when they were combined with reading support or compared to no intervention at all, didn't lead to significant improvement in reading.
Hmm.
But it's also important to note here that was a much smaller group of studies they were looking at. There were only 3 that really fit that criteria.
Okay. So limited evidence. Okay, so
Yeah.
so then what about this idea that it's more of a cycle? Like this bidirectional thing where the reading problems and the behavior problems are kind of feeding off each other.
Yeah.
What did the research say about that?
So this was interesting. They were comparing interventions that had both the reading and the behavior support, so combined interventions.
Yeah.
And they were comparing that to just reading interventions alone. And, if you're thinking about this bidirectional theory, you would think that, okay, the combined interventions would lead to bigger gains in reading.
Right. Yeah.
But what they actually saw was descriptively so, not necessarily statistically significant, but they saw that reading interventions alone actually had larger improvements in reading.
Wow.
Yeah. And again, here it's important to think about which studies were included in that specific comparison.
Okay. Okay. So that is kind of a surprise. I think, our gut instinct would be like, well, if you're tackling both, then you're going to get better results. So it sounds like, if the research didn't really strongly support any of those like direct links between reading and behavior, did they look at any other factors that might be kind of at play in terms of how well these interventions work?
Absolutely. So they did what we call moderator analysis, where they try and look at characteristics of either the student or the interventions to say, okay, is there anything that makes these interventions more or less effective?
Right.
And the key finding here was that only one factor ended up being statistically significant, and that was whether or not there was a specific behavior support component to the intervention.
Interesting. So did that mean that adding behavior support actually made the reading interventions work better?
It's a bit counterintuitive.
Okay.
The analysis actually found that interventions that didn't have a behavior support component had a larger positive impact on reading.
Wow, that is so counterintuitive when you think about students who, are also dealing with these behavioral challenges.
It is, and it's really important here to add some context.
Yeah.
This particular finding was really driven by one study from 2008,
Okay.
and that study had some pretty big limitations. It didn't meet the standards set by the What Works Clearinghouse,
Right.
which is kind of the gold standard for evaluating educational research.
Right.
They also used some measures that, could have introduced bias, and they had a really, really large effect size, like way bigger than any of the other studies in the analysis.
Mm.
So even though it reached statistical significance, we have to be really careful about drawing too many conclusions based on that one study alone.
Right. Right.
It just kind of shows how one study that might not be the best quality
Mm-hmm.
can kind of skew the results a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So outside of that one statistically significant factor, were there any other like interesting trends or patterns that the researchers observed? Even if they didn't reach that level of statistical significance?
Yeah, there were a few descriptive trends, and it's good to keep an eye on these moving forward, but they found that studies that were rated as higher quality tended to have smaller effect sizes.
No. Interesting.
Studies that used a quasi-experimental design, so that means that, the students weren't randomly assigned to the different groups.
Yeah.
Those actually seem to show larger effects than those that were truly randomized controlled trials,
Mm-hmm.
which are usually considered kind of the best type of research design.
Yeah.
They also saw that interventions for older students, so we're talking second grade and above,
Yeah.
had larger effects than for those little ones in K and first.
Right.
And finally, they saw that if the intervention was just for kids with EBD, it seemed to have a larger effect than interventions that included kids with both EBD and ADHD.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So those are, again, they're not necessarily statistically significant, but definitely worth noting.
Right, right. Keep an eye on those.
So we've talked about the overall impact and then some of those factors that might be kind of influencing how well the interventions work, or maybe not.
Yeah.
What about the actual interventions themselves? Like, what did they look like? Were there like any common approaches or kind of patterns that emerged?
So for younger kids, and we're talking K-5 generally,
Right.
it was really about building foundational
Yes.
skills. So we're talking, phonemic awareness,
Mm.
phonics, fluency, all those good things.
Right? Those building blocks.
Exactly. And the interventions were usually in a small group setting, sometimes one-on-one, and they were often either commercial programs or, things that the researchers developed specifically for the study.
Okay. Okay. What about older kids, like those in middle and high school, like 6th through 12th grade?
Yeah, that's where the research really drops off.
Yeah.
They only found a small number of studies that focused on older kids,
Hmm.
and those tended to focus more on reading comprehension.
Okay.
So it's definitely, a big area for future research, like how do we best support these older students?
Huge gap. You also mentioned that some of these reading interventions included behavior support.
Yeah.
So in practice, what did that actually look like? Like, how are they incorporating those supports into the reading interventions?
It varied quite a bit. Some of them use positive reinforcement, rewards for desired
Uh,
behaviors. Some of them use performance-based contingencies. So, you get a reward if you reach a certain goal.
right.
Some included social skills training. And in a few cases, even medication was part of the support that was provided. But
Mm.
because there was so much variation, it was tough for the researchers to really isolate the impact of the behavior supports on reading specifically.
Yeah, it makes sense. It sounds like the quality of the research is really important, right? Like, how did this meta-analysis go about evaluating the quality of all those studies that it looked at?
They used the standards set by the What Works Clearinghouse, or WWC,
Right.
which we talked about a little bit earlier, kind of the gold standard for educational research.
Yeah, the gatekeepers.
So based on those standards, the studies were categorized into, 3 different levels: met standards without reservations, met standards with reservations, or just flat out didn't meet standards.
Okay.
And that gives us a better idea of, how much we can really trust the findings.
Yeah, yeah. Last but not least, one thing that often comes up with meta-analyses is this idea of publication bias. Like, studies that find positive or like really exciting results are more likely to get published.
Right.
So, did the researchers address that at all? Like, was there any way to know if the findings were maybe a little bit skewed because of that?
They did. They used a statistical technique called trim and fill
Okay.
to check for that. And what they found, actually, is that the reported effect size might even be an underestimate.
Really?
Yeah, and this goes back to that 2008 study we were talking about earlier
Right.
with the huge effects. The trim and fill analysis suggests that if there were other unpublished studies that also showed big positive effects, then the overall effect size might actually be even bigger.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
What are like the key takeaways for educators and, other professionals who are working with these students? Like, what can we really take from all of this and apply in our practice?
For those younger elementary school students, the ones that are experiencing both reading and behavioral challenges,
Mm.
the research is positive.
Yeah.
It suggests that if we give them systematic, explicit instruction in those foundational reading skills,
Hmm.
particularly in a small group setting,
Yeah.
they can make gains in their early reading and word reading skills.
Mm.
But, and this is a huge but,
Yeah.
the meta-analysis didn't find that those improvements in reading would then automatically lead to improvements in behavior.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
That distinction's really, really important to make. So, what are your thoughts then on the role of behavior supports in these interventions? Like, should we be including them? Should we not be including them? What are we thinking?
So even though the meta-analysis didn't necessarily show strong support for adding behavior support to reading interventions to improve reading, that doesn't mean that it's not important.
Right.
It might still be really beneficial to have those supports in place, but within the context of the reading intervention itself.
Yeah. Okay.
So that might look like, clear expectations, consistent routines, strategies to help kids stay focused and engaged during the reading activities. And then for some students who have more significant needs, more persistent, challenging behaviors, you might need a more individualized and intensive behavior plan.
Right.
Something that's really tailored to their specific needs to really support them alongside that reading intervention.
Yeah, it makes sense. It definitely sounds like there's still a lot we don't know. What are some of the kind of key areas for future research that you think this meta-analysis kind of pointed to?
Well, the researchers themselves acknowledged that there were limitations to this work.
Mhm.
We need more research, period. We need more studies that are, really rigorous with large samples of students.
Right.
And there's a huge gap in our understanding of what works for those older students.
Mm-hmm.
Middle school, high school, we really need to figure that out.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then more research that's specifically looking at how reading and behavior interventions kind of interact with each other.
Right.
Like, how do they work together?
Yeah.
What works best? For whom? Under what conditions? Lots of questions there.
It sounds like the way we're measuring behavior too is something that, needs some attention moving forward.
You're absolutely right. The meta-analysis pointed out that a lot of the studies relied on indirect measures of behavior,
Yeah.
like, teacher surveys or rating scales.
Right.
And what we really need are more direct observation methods
Yeah.
to see, what's actually happening with students' behavior, both during the reading instruction and in other situations.
Makes sense. And then finally, what about medication? For those students who have co-occurring ADHD, along with the reading difficulties, like where does that fit in?
Yeah, that's another area where we just don't have enough evidence yet.
Hmm.
The studies in this meta-analysis were kind of all over the place.
Right.
Some showed positive effects, some didn't.
Yeah.
And it was really tough to figure out if the medication itself was making a difference or if it was something else.
Yeah.
So we really need more research to tease that apart.
Yeah, absolutely. So, listener, if you're still with us, we've really gone deep here. But, I think the takeaway is that reading interventions can definitely be helpful for students who are dealing with both reading and behavior challenges.
Yeah.
But the relationship between the two is complex, and there's still a lot we don't understand. So, this deep dive was really about, showing you what we know so far, particularly for younger students, but also highlighting all those really important questions that still need answers.
I think it's a great point. And I'm curious, considering everything we've talked about, listener, what questions are popping up for you about how we can best support these students?
Yeah.
What areas of research do you think are most important to pursue?
Yeah.
Now, this meta-analysis has really opened up the conversation and shown us how much more there is to learn.
Absolutely. All right. Well, on that note, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. See you next time.
See ya.